If we want to understand the hidden proxy war between Iran and the United States, we have to start with a simple but uncomfortable truth. This is not a conflict that began in recent years, and it is not one that is easily visible on the surface. And so it is the product of history, identity, and a series of strategic decisions that gradually reshaped how both sides see the world and each other. Before 1979, the relationship between the United States and Iran was fundamentally different. Iran under the Shah was a key regional partner for the United States. It was part of a broader Cold War strategy where the U.S. sought to contain Soviet influence by supporting aligned governments in strategically important regions. In that context, Iran was not an adversary. It was an ally, or at least a partner with shared interests. But then came the Iranian Revolution. This was not just a change in leadership, it was a transformation of identity. The Islamic Revolution redefined Iran's political system, its ideology, and its position in the global order. And in doing so, it also redefined its relationship with the United States. From Iran's perspective, the revolution was about reclaiming sovereignty, about rejecting foreign influence and asserting independence. But from the United States' perspective, it marked a dramatic and unexpected shift. But a former partner had become an unpredictable and at times openly hostile actor. And once that shift occurred, the logic of the relationship changed. Because international relations are not just about interests, they are about trust, perception, and expectations. And when trust breaks down, actors begin to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The 1979 hostage crisis was a turning point. It wasn't just a diplomatic incident, it was a psychological rupture. It created deep mistrust on both sides and set the tone for decades of tension that followed. But here's where the story becomes more complex. Despite this hostility, the United States and Iran did not engage in direct war. Instead, their conflict evolved into something more subtle, more layered, and in many ways more difficult to resolve, a proxy war. Why proxy warfare? Because direct confrontation between the United States and Iran would carry enormous risks. The United States, with its global military presence, and Iran with its regional influence, both understood that a direct war would be costly, unpredictable, and potentially destabilizing far beyond the region itself. So instead, the conflict moved into the spaces in between. It shifted into regions like Iraq and Afghanistan. It became embedded in political movements, militias, and local power struggles. And it began to unfold through indirect engagement where both sides could compete, influence, and counter each other without crossing the threshold into full-scale war. From a strategic standpoint, this is a form of controlled conflict. It allows both sides to pursue their objectives while managing risk. But from a broader perspective, it creates a system where conflict is persistent but rarely resolved, and that persistence has consequences. Because over time, proxy conflicts tend to become self-sustaining. They create their own ecosystems. Local actors become more empowered, alliances become more entrenched, and the original conflict between major powers becomes embedded in a much larger and more complex web of relationships. This is exactly what we see in the US-Iran dynamic in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. These are not just battlegrounds. They are arenas where influence is contested, where power is projected, and where both sides test each other's limits. And importantly, these arenas are not static. They evolve. They shift with political changes, economic pressures, and local dynamics. Now, let's step back and look at the psychological dimension of this. Because in a proxy war, perception becomes everything. Each side is constantly trying to interpret the actions of the other. A shift in policy, a military deployment, a political statement, these are all analyzed for intent. Are they defensive? Are they aggressive? Are they signals of escalation or attempts at deterrence? And because these interpretations are rarely certain, they introduce ambiguity into the system. That ambiguity creates space for maneuver, but it also creates risk. Because when you are operating in an environment where intentions are unclear, you have to prepare for a wide range of possible outcomes. And that preparation often involves building capabilities, forming alliances, and taking preemptive actions that can themselves be interpreted as threatening. So you begin to see a cycle. Each side takes steps to increase its security. Those steps are perceived as threats by the other side. That perception leads to countermeasures, and those countermeasures reinforce the original sense of insecurity. This is the security dilemma in action, and it is one of the core drivers of prolonged conflict. But there is something deeper here as well, because this conflict is not just about strategy, it is about narrative. The United States sees itself as a stabilizing force in the international system, committed to maintaining order and protecting its interests and those of its allies. Iran, on the other hand, often frames itself as a resistance actor, a state pushing back against external dominance and asserting its sovereignty in a region shaped by foreign intervention. These narratives are powerful. They shape how each side interprets events. They influence domestic politics, and they define the boundaries of what is considered acceptable behavior. And once these narratives are established, they become difficult to change. Because changing a narrative is not just about adjusting policy, it is about reshaping identity. And identity, especially at the national level, is deeply resistant to change. So, what we are left with is a conflict that is not just geopolitical, but psychological, not just strategic, but symbolic. A conflict where actions are taken not only to achieve immediate objectives, but to reinforce long-term positions, where influence is measured not just in territory, but in perception, and where every move is part of a larger, ongoing effort to shape the balance of power. And that brings us to the central question. If this proxy war has been sustained for decades by a combination of history, perception, and strategic necessity, what would it take to change that trajectory? Because understanding the origins of this conflict is not just about explaining the past, it is about recognizing the forces that continue to shape the present and asking whether those forces can be redirected before they define the future. If history and perception explain why the US-Iran rivalry exists, then networks explain how it is sustained, because this is not a conventional conflict between two clearly defined adversaries on a battlefield. It is a conflict that has expanded outward into alliances, partnerships, and influence structures that extend across borders and operate with varying degrees of visibility and control. When we talk about Iran's approach, we're really talking about a strategy of distributed influence. Iran understands that it cannot and does not need to compete with the United States on conventional military terms, where instead it has developed a system of influence that works through proximity, alignment, and leverage. This means building relationships with groups that share overlapping interests. These groups are not always identical in ideology or structure, but they are connected by a common thread: resistance to U.S. influence, and in some cases, opposition to the regional order supported by the United States and its allies. What emerges from this approach is not a single army, but a network, a web of relationships that spans multiple countries, including Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. These relationships allow Iran to project power without direct confrontation. They create strategic depth, and they allow Iran to respond to pressure in ways that are indirect, flexible, and often difficult to attribute with certainty. From a strategic perspective, this is highly effective because networks offer a form of resilience. If one node is weakened, others can continue operating. If pressure is applied in one area, it can be absorbed or redirected elsewhere. And if direct confrontation becomes too costly, influence can still be maintained through indirect means. But this approach also changes the nature of the conflict, because once you move into a networked system, the battlefield is no longer centralized. It is distributed. And that means the US-Iran conflict is no longer confined to a single region or a single set of actors. It becomes embedded in local conflicts, political dynamics, and security environments that have their own histories and internal logic. So this is where things become more complex, because local actors are not just passive participants. They have their own goals, their own motivations, and their own calculations. They are influenced by external powers, but they are not controlled by them in a simple linear way. This creates a layered system of interaction where global strategies intersect with local realities. And when that happens, outcomes become harder to predict. Now, from the US perspective, this networked environment presents a different kind of challenge. The United States does not operate through a single network in the same way Iran does. Instead, it relies on a combination of formal alliances, military presence, and partnerships with local governments and institutions. These relationships are often more structured, more visible, and more institutionally defined, but they also require constant maintenance. Because alliances are not static, they depend on trust, shared interests, and ongoing coordination. And when those elements are strained by political disagreements, shifting priorities, or local pressures, the effectiveness of the alliance can be reduced. So what we see is not just a competition between two states, but a competition between two different models of influence. One is more centralized, formal, and institutionally driven. The other is more decentralized, flexible, and network-based. And in many ways, this reflects a broader transformation in global power, because we are no longer in a world where power is defined solely by direct control. Power today is increasingly about influence across networks, about the ability to shape outcomes without necessarily owning the process entirely. But this creates a new kind of risk, because networks are inherently complex. They are made up of multiple actors, each with their own agency. And that means that control is never absolute. Influence is never guaranteed, and outcomes are always subject to a degree of uncertainty. This is where psychology becomes critical, because in a networked conflict, perception is not just important, it is central. Each side is constantly interpreting the actions of the other, trying to understand not only what is happening, but what it means within the broader system. And because these networks are interconnected, actions in one part of the system can have unintended consequences in another. A decision made in one region can ripple across multiple actors, triggering responses that were not originally anticipated. This is the nature of complex systems. They are sensitive to small changes, and those changes can produce disproportionately large effects. So, you end up in a situation where both sides are operating with incomplete information, trying to anticipate the moves of an adversary that is itself operating through a decentralized network. That uncertainty creates tension because when you cannot fully predict the actions of the other side, you have to prepare for a wide range of possibilities. And that preparation often involves taking actions that can be interpreted as escalatory. This creates a feedback loop. Each side responds to perceived threats by strengthening its position. Those actions are then perceived as further threats by the other side, leading to additional responses. And over time, this cycle reinforces the very dynamics it was intended to counter. This is the paradox of networked conflict. It allows for flexibility and resilience, but it also creates a system where tension is persistent and where small actions can accumulate into larger consequences. Now, let's step back and look at the philosophical dimension of this, because what we are really witnessing is a shift in the nature of power itself. Power is no longer just about controlling territory or defeating an adversary in open conflict. It is about shaping systems. It is about influencing relationships. And it is about operating within a web of interconnected actors where outcomes are not determined by a single decision, but by the interaction of many. In that sense, the US-Iran proxy dynamic is not just a conflict between two states. It is a reflection of how power operates in the modern world, a world where influence is distributed, where control is partial, and where the lines between war and peace are increasingly blurred. So the question is not just how this network operates, but how stable it is. Because networks by their nature are dynamic, they evolve, they shift, and under certain conditions, they can become unstable. And when that happens, the consequences can extend far beyond the original actors involved. So we are left with a critical reflection. In a world where power is exercised through networks, how do we manage the risks that come from systems we do not fully control? Because the more complex the network becomes, the more influence it can generate and the more unpredictable its outcomes can be. So if Iran has built a network strategy to project influence, then the United States has responded with a different kind of system, one that relies on presence, partnerships, and pressure. And together, these two approaches have created a dynamic that is less about direct confrontation and more about constant calibrated competition. But here's the important point. The United States is not simply reacting. It is actively shaping this environment through its own set of tools, many of which are designed to counter influence without triggering a full-scale war. This is where strategy becomes more subtle. Because unlike Iran's network-based approach, the United States operates through a combination of formal alliances, forward military presence, and strategic partnerships. These include long-standing relationships with countries across the Middle East, where U.S. influence is embedded not just through military assets, but through political, economic, and security cooperation. These relationships serve multiple purposes. They act as deterrents. They provide stability. And they create a framework through which the United States can respond to regional developments without needing to act alone. But they also create obligations, because alliances are not one way. When the United States commits to supporting a partner, it is not just projecting power, it is also making a commitment to respond if that partner is threatened, and that commitment introduces complexity into decision-making. So now you have a system where the United States is not only managing its relationship with Iran, but also managing its relationships with multiple other actors in the region, each of whom has their own expectations and concerns. This creates a web of interconnected responsibilities, and within that web, every action has to be carefully calibrated, because a strike in one location might be seen as a necessary response by one ally, but as an escalation by another. A show of force might reassure one partner while alarming another. And in a region as sensitive as the Middle East, those perceptions matter. So what emerges is a kind of strategic balancing act. The United States seeks to deter Iranian influence, but without triggering a broader conflict. It seeks to support its allies, but without overcommitting. And it seeks to maintain stability while also preserving its strategic flexibility. This is not easy, because deterrence itself is a delicate concept. It is based on the idea that if you demonstrate strength, you can prevent conflict. But if that demonstration is too aggressive, it can provoke the very response it is meant to avoid. So, The United States is constantly navigating this tension between showing enough strength to deter, but not so much as to escalate. So, and this is where military presence becomes important. Forward deployed forces, naval assets, air capabilities, these are not just tools of war, they are tools of signaling. They communicate commitment, they signal readiness, and they serve as a reminder of capability. But they also introduce risk, because when forces are deployed in close proximity to potential adversaries, the likelihood of unintended incidents increases. And in a high-tension environment, even a small incident can become a catalyst for escalation. So you begin to see how the system works. Iran uses networks to extend its influence indirectly. The United States uses its presence and partnerships to counter that influence. And both sides are operating in a space where actions are interpreted not just tactically, but strategically. This creates a dynamic where each move is part of a broader conversation. A strike here, a response there, a statement, a deployment. Each action is sending a message, and each message is being interpreted, analyzed, and responded to. Now, let's talk about the psychological dimension of this dynamic. Because in a system like this, decision makers are operating under constant pressure. They are not just responding to external threats, they are managing internal expectations. They are balancing the need to demonstrate strength with the need to avoid unnecessary escalation. And they are doing this in an environment where information is incomplete and uncertainty is high. That kind of environment changes how decisions are made. It increases the emphasis on risk management. It encourages caution, but also creates pressure to act decisively. And it can lead to situations where actions are taken not just because they are optimal, but because they are necessary to maintain credibility. And credibility in international relations is everything. Because if a state is perceived as unwilling to act when it says it will, its deterrence weakens. But if it acts too aggressively, it risks escalation. So credibility becomes a balancing act, one that requires constant calibration. Now, let's bring this back to the broader system. What we are seeing is not just a series of isolated actions. It is a continuous interaction between two strategic approaches, one based on networks and indirect influence, and the other based on alliances, presence, and deterrence. And both approaches are trying to achieve the same goal: shape the environment without triggering full-scale war. But here's the challenge. Because both sides are operating within the same system, their actions inevitably affect each other. And as each side adjusts its strategy, the other side responds. This creates a cycle of action and reaction, of signaling and interpretation, of pressure and response. And over time, that cycle can become self-reinforcing, because each action is not just a response to the present, it is also shaped by the history of previous interactions. And that history builds expectations, it creates patterns, and it narrows the range of possible responses. So, even when both sides want to avoid war, the system they are operating in can make it increasingly difficult to do so. This is the paradox of strategic competition. The tools used to prevent conflict can, under certain conditions, contribute to its escalation. And that brings us to a critical question. In a system defined by deterrence, alliances, and networked influence, how do you maintain stability without unintentionally increasing the risk of escalation? Because the more you engage in this system, the more you reinforce it. And the more you reinforce it, the more difficult it becomes to step away from it. And in the end, we are left with a fundamental tension between control and unpredictability, between strategy and reaction, and between the desire to prevent conflict and the risk of making it more likely. And the question we have to ask ourselves is this: in a world where every move is a signal and every signal is interpreted through the lens of past conflict, how do we ensure that our efforts to maintain stability do not become the very forces that push us closer to instability? If the United States and Iran have managed this rivalry through networks, alliances, and strategic signaling, then the final and most dangerous dimension is escalation. Because everything we've discussed so far operates under one shared assumption that both sides want to avoid full-scale war. But that assumption is not a guarantee. It is a condition. And like all conditions in geopolitics, it can change. Escalation is not a single event. It is a process. It begins when actions start to exceed expectations, when responses become more forceful, when the margin for restraint begins to narrow, and most importantly, when signals are misread. Because in a system this complex, miscalculation is not an exception. It is a possibility built into the structure itself. Think about how escalation typically unfolds in a proxy environment. It rarely starts with a direct confrontation between major powers. Instead, it begins with an incident involving a proxy group, a localized strike, or a targeted operation. On its own, that incident may seem limited, manageable, even contained. But then comes the response. and the response is rarely identical. It is calibrated. It is measured, but it is also meant to send a message, and that message in turn is interpreted by the other side, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. And once interpretation becomes part of the equation, the system becomes more volatile, because now you are not just responding to actions, you are responding to perceived intentions. This is where escalation risk increases. Each side begins to adjust its behavior based on how it thinks the other side will act next. That anticipation shapes decisions, and those decisions shape the next move in the sequence. Over time, what you get is a feedback loop. Pressure leads to response, response leads to counter-response, and each iteration moves the system slightly further away from equilibrium. But here's the critical insight. Escalation is often not the result of a single decision to go to war. It is the cumulative effect of many smaller decisions, each one made with a different intention. One side may be trying to deter, the other may be trying to test limits, a third party may be trying to exploit the situation, and in that mix of intentions, the system becomes increasingly difficult to predict. Now add external actors into this equation. Because neither the United States nor Iran operates in isolation, there are allies, partners, and regional stakeholders whose interests are also affected by the trajectory of this conflict. And those actors can either help stabilize the situation or accelerate escalation. If allies feel threatened, they may push for stronger responses. If they feel abandoned, they may act independently. And if they perceive weakness, they may adjust their own behavior in ways that increase overall instability. So now you have a multi-layered system. You have two primary actors. You have a network of proxy groups. You have regional allies, and you have global stakeholders all interacting within a highly sensitive environment. And in that kind of system, small changes can have large effects. This is what we mean when we talk about tipping points. A tipping point is not always visible until it is reached. It is the moment when the system shifts from one state to another, from containment to escalation, from limited conflict to broader confrontation, And once that shift happens, the dynamics change. Because at that point, decisions are no longer just about signaling or deterrence. They become about survival, credibility, and control over the trajectory of the conflict. And when survival enters the equation, the psychology of decision-making changes. Leaders may become more risk-tolerant in some cases or more risk-averse in others, or they may act more quickly. They may rely more heavily on military options, and they may prioritize short-term stability over long-term consequences. This is where the danger lies. Because in moments of high tension, the pressure to act can override the discipline required to de-escalate. And once that threshold is crossed, it becomes very difficult to return to the previous state. Now, let's step back and look at the philosophical dimension of escalation. At its core, escalation is about control. It is about how much control each side has over the situation and how much control they are willing to risk losing. In a stable system, control is maintained through predictability, through clear communication, through established boundaries. But in a conflict like this, those elements are constantly under pressure. And as that pressure increases, control becomes more difficult to maintain. So you end up in a paradox. The more each side tries to assert control, the more unpredictable the system becomes. And the more unpredictable the system becomes, the harder it is to control. This is the essence of escalation risk. It is not just about what either side wants, it is about what the system allows. And in a system this interconnected, this sensitive, and this reactive, the range of possible outcomes is wide. That does not mean war is inevitable, but it does mean that the path to war or the path away from it is not linear. It depends on decisions, on perceptions, on timing, and on a level of coordination that is difficult to achieve in moments of crisis. So, when we ask whether this proxy conflict could escalate into something larger, we are really asking a deeper question. We are asking whether the mechanisms that have contained this conflict, deterrence, signaling, restraint, are strong enough to withstand the pressures they are now facing. Because if those mechanisms hold, the conflict remains contained. But if they fail even partially, the system begins to shift. And once that shift begins, the consequences extend far beyond the original actors. Because escalation does not respect boundaries. It does not stay confined to one region. It spreads. It evolves. And it can draw in actors who were not originally part of the conflict. And that is when a regional proxy war can begin to resemble something much larger. So the question we are left with is not just about the past or even the present. It is about the future. In a system defined by networks, deterrence, and constant signaling, what happens when one miscalculation pushes the system beyond the point where restraint can hold? Because in that moment, the shadow that has contained this conflict for decades may no longer be enough to keep it from becoming something far more dangerous.